The first note was not a whisper. It was a piercing cry of music that cut through the night air like broken glass, silencing the laughter that had echoed seconds before. People who had been pointing fingers and smirking froze in place as the homeless black girl lifted her head, her eyes closed, and unleashed a sound so raw it bent the air around her. Some clutched their phones tighter, expecting another joke to upload online, but instead, their screens captured a performance they could never have imagined. Her voice rose higher, trembling yet commanding, and for a moment the busy street itself seemed to hold its breath. Then it happened, the second eruption. A man who had mocked her minutes earlier dropped the half-eaten burger from his hand, tears suddenly stinging his eyes. He didn't understand why, but the sound she carried reached the place hunger and pride had kept hidden. Strangers, who moments before were entertained by her humiliation, now found themselves powerless under the weight of her song. And then the shock arrived. A soft clang as a tin cup, the one she had placed by her side to beg for food, was no longer empty. Not coins. Not crumpled bills. But a diamond ring, dropped by a woman whose perfect nails and designer coat betrayed her world of comfort. The girl's voice had cut through layers of arrogance, forcing even the wealthy to see the humanity they had denied her. That was the night everything changed. But before her golden voice forced a crowd to bow in silence, she had been nothing more than a shadow on the sidewalk. Hungry. Exhausted. Invisible. Have you ever judged someone at their lowest, only to later realize you were staring at greatness? If you believe more people need to hear stories like this, subscribe now before you scroll away and forget the girl they tried to laugh into silence. Hours earlier, the night had been merciless. The streets pulsed with neon lights, but they gave her no warmth. Her name was Ayana, though no one asked, to them she was just another figure curled against the stone walls of the plaza. Her hair, tangled but still carrying traces of beauty, framed eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. The hunger gnawed worse than the cold. She had tried holding a cardboard sign, tried whispering requests for change, but pity was in short supply. Every plea met with blank stares, or worse, with laughter. When she asked, "Can I sing for food?" they sneered louder, amused by her audacity. The crowd wasn't cruel because they didn't hear her. They were cruel because they thought they already knew her. Just another girl discarded by the city. Just another mouth that had nothing to offer. But Ayana had something left, a voice hidden deep in her chest, a fire she had guarded even when sleep was on cold pavement. And tonight, starving and desperate, she chose to unleash it. The first step was trembling. Her knees shook as she pulled herself up from the ground. Passers-by noticed, chuckling at her awkwardness. Phones were raised. A spectacle to mock. One voice from the crowd jeered, "What's next, girl? A concert ticket?" The laughter was sharp, slicing into her already fragile spirit. She pressed her hand against her ribs, where the ache of hunger twisted like a knife. But then she looked upward, the buildings towering above, the endless sky beyond, and she closed her eyes. Her lips parted. And the city heard something it could never laugh at again. The voice that rose was soaked in pain, in years of rejection, in nights spent invisible. But layered into that pain was purity, a tone that rang so clear, so angelic, that the noise of traffic faltered beneath it. Some turned to leave, but froze in place. Others who had been smirking lowered their phones slowly, realizing they were no longer watching comedy, they were witnessing revelation. And yet, not everyone was ready to let go of their cruelty. A young man near the front shouted, "Sing louder. Maybe the rats will dance." His voice tried to bring the laughter back. But Ayana's next note rose like thunder, silencing him mid-smirk. The sound trembled through the plaza until even his eyes dropped to the ground. Do you see how quickly the crowd turned? One moment, jeering, the next, captive. Subscribe if you believe no voice should be buried by hunger, so you never miss when another Ayana rises. That night had begun as a joke at her expense. But as the sound poured from her, the city began to learn a cruel lesson. The girl they laughed at was not begging for scraps. She was demanding to be heard. And from that moment, the world would never forget her name. The last note of Ayana's song hadn't faded before the plaza erupted into silence. The kind of silence that bends the air, makes people shuffle nervously, and forces every heart to hear its own beating. The same mouths that had curled into cruel smirks minutes earlier were now tight, uncertain, and ashamed. She swayed slightly on her feet, clutching her notebook against her chest. The hunger was still there, roaring louder than applause ever could. Her ribs ached from the effort of pulling sound from a body that hadn't been fed, but she refused to collapse before the crowd. For a long, jagged moment, no one moved. A mother tightened her grip on her child's mittened hand, unsure whether to stay or flee from the weight of what she had just heard. A teenager lowered his phone, realizing the clip he had recorded wasn't comedy anymore, it was proof of something he didn't have the language for. A businessman with shiny cufflinks stared at the ground, the echo of his own laughter still ringing in his ears like a confession. And then, as if on cue, someone spoke, "Do another one." The words weren't loud, but they cracked the frozen air. A ripple moved through the crowd. Faces turned back to Ayana, no longer sneering, but pleading. The irony was bitter, when she begged for food, they laughed. Now they begged for her voice, and they expected her to give it freely. Her lips trembled. She didn't want to open them again. Not for them. Not for those who had mocked her hunger as entertainment. But survival is cruel, it forces you to sing for the same mouths that scorned you. Ayana lifted her head. The street lamps above her buzzed faintly, moths orbiting the light as if even they couldn't leave. She inhaled, and for a heartbeat the city's ordinary noises pressed in, horns blaring, vendors shouting, the hiss of fryer oil. But then she exhaled, and her voice rose again. This time softer. Not thunder, but embers. A low hymn about doors, doors that slam, doors that stay locked, and doors that sometimes open when you least expect them. Each line floated across the plaza, fragile yet unbreakable, and the crowd leaned in as if the very act of listening could keep it alive. A boy near the front blinked rapidly, his breath fogging in the cold air. He was the same one who had mocked her first, calling her a joke, daring her to perform like a circus act. Now his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He shoved them into his jacket pockets, pulled out a folded bill, and dropped it silently into the empty hat someone had placed by her side. He didn't look at her when he did it. His shame was too fresh. The sound of the bill brushing the fabric was almost louder than the applause that would later come. It was the sound of a conscience, raw and clumsy. Have you ever laughed at someone only to later realize you were the cruel one? If you don't want to be caught on the wrong side of a story like this, subscribe now before you look away. Ayana kept singing. Each word tore at her throat, but she refused to stop. The song was her shield now, her weapon, her only proof that she was more than a body on concrete. A man in a food truck apron stepped forward, carrying a steaming container. He didn't announce his act of kindness, didn't film it for validation, he just placed the food at her feet and returned to his grill. The smell, rice and beans drenched in spices, rose like incense. Ayana's stomach twisted painfully, but she pressed her lips tighter, refusing to break the melody. Behind the crowd, 2 security guards edged closer. Not to drive her away, as she expected, but to shield her. They positioned themselves at either side, their eyes scanning for pickpockets, their stance protective. It was as if her song had turned them from enforcers into guardians. Her voice grew steadier. She sang of names, names people remember, names people bury, and names that rise again no matter how hard the world presses them down. Some in the crowd wept quietly, not just for her, but for themselves. They had been exposed, their cruelty reflected back like a mirror, and the reflection was not kind. Phones lit the air. At first they had filmed her humiliation. Now they streamed her resurrection. Comments raced across the screens. Who is she? That voice. God, I feel this. The digital applause multiplied faster than the coins hitting the hat. And then the unexpected happened. A woman with a velvet headband, the same who had tossed her diamond ring as if it were a trick, bent down, picked it up again, and slid it back onto her finger. A murmur rose from the crowd. For a moment it seemed as if her act had undone the gift, erased the power of what Ayana had created. But then the woman removed it a second time. She looked at it, long and hard, her polished nails trembling, and placed it back into the hat with care, not impulse, not arrogance this time, but surrender. The murmur died into stillness. People understood. Something inside her had cracked open, and this was not performance anymore, it was repentance. Would you have been one of the people laughing? Or would you have walked away without helping? Subscribe so you never forget stories like hers, because the next Ayana you see might be in your city. Ayana's knees buckled as the song reached its final line. Her body begged her to stop, but her spirit forced her forward. She sang the last note as if it were her heartbeat escaping into the night, and when it ended, she staggered backward and sank onto the cold stone. The applause that followed wasn't wild. It wasn't the applause of a stadium or a concert hall. It was something heavier. The sound of guilt trying to wash itself clean. The hat at her feet now bulged with crumpled bills, coins, even a folded transit pass. Someone whispered, "You matter," as they laid a small candle beside her. A delivery rider placed a reflective blanket around her shoulders before vanishing back into the night. Ayana clutched the notebook to her chest and looked up at the sky. The stars above the city were faint, nearly drowned by neon and pollution, but she believed they were there. Somewhere beyond the towers of glass and steel, light still existed that couldn't be mocked or stolen. And in that moment, she wasn't invisible anymore. If this voice can move strangers in the cold, imagine what it can do if you stay. Subscribe now, don't scroll past another life that deserves to be heard. Ayana's final note still clung to the stone walls of the plaza, but it didn't stop there. It escaped into 100 phones lifted high, broadcast in real time to strangers who hadn't laughed at her but were now staring at screens with the same wide-eyed silence that had gripped the crowd. The live stream comments multiplied like sparks. Where is this? I'm crying and I don't know why. God, she sounds like she swallowed sunlight. Within minutes, a performance that had begun as the cruel amusement of a handful of passers-by was being watched in apartments, hospital waiting rooms, subway cars, and lonely night shifts across the city. Ayana didn't know any of it. She sat on the ground, scarf wrapped tightly around her, notebook clutched against her chest like a shield. She wasn't thinking about fame or viral videos, she was thinking about warmth, about the food still steaming in the paper bag, about how long her body could keep carrying her voice before it gave out entirely. But the city had begun whispering her name. A man named Victor, leaning on a mop in the lobby of a hotel, paused mid-swipe as the video rolled across his coworker's phone. The marble floor beneath him reflected the clip like a second stage. He muttered under his breath, "She's out here starving, and we're here polishing the shine of other people's wealth." At that same moment, in a hospital break room, a nurse with dark circles under her eyes leaned over a colleague's shoulder. The sound of Ayana's voice filled the sterile room, drowning out the hum of vending machines and overhead pages. The nurse whispered, "She's freezing in that video, and we're complaining about bad coffee." In the back of a taxi, a driver listened through the tinny speaker of a passenger's phone and felt his throat tighten. He thought of his daughter practicing scales on a borrowed keyboard at home, dreaming of stages she may never reach. The city couldn't look away. Back in the plaza, Ayana tried to stand, but her legs shook. She pressed her palm to the ground, grounding herself against the roughness of the stone. She wasn't used to being surrounded by faces waiting for her, not like this. For years, her audience had been walls, alleys, and the occasional mercy of church basements. Now there were cameras, eyes, and something even heavier, expectation. Her stomach turned, not from hunger this time, but from the burden of suddenly mattering. Someone pressed a water bottle into her hand. Another draped a heavier coat across her shoulders. The security guard with gray temples gave her a small nod, as if to say, "You're safe for now." But Ayana wasn't naive. She had lived too long on the edge to believe kindness was permanent. The same mouths that cheered tonight might spit tomorrow. She knew the world loved spectacle as much as it loved cruelty. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had carved a wound in the city's conscience. How many times have you walked past someone's pain and told yourself they'd be fine? If you know you've done it, hit subscribe and admit it, don't hide from what's true. Hours passed, and the crowd thinned. But the live stream didn't die. Viewers shared it again and again. A student edited it into a short clip with subtitles, "Homeless Girl Sings Like Heaven." A blogger reposted it with the caption, "She asked for food." They laughed. Then this happened. It spread in real time, carried not by algorithms alone but by guilt, awe, and something rarer, hope. Ayana sat in the shadow of a building, the food truck bag empty now, her hands wrapped tightly around her notebook. Her voice was silent, but the city was still singing her. On the other side of town, a man named Harold was scrolling through his feed in a bar. His friends laughed at memes, but his eyes froze when he saw her face, the way she closed her eyes mid-note, the way her ribs pressed against fabric too thin for the cold. "Turn that up," Harold demanded, but his friends rolled their eyes. "It's just another viral clip." Harold turned the volume up himself. The bar's chatter dimmed under Ayana's voice. For a moment, even the clinking glasses seemed to pause. Strangers looked at one another, realizing they weren't laughing, they were listening. What if the voice you ignore tonight is the one you'll wish you heard tomorrow? Subscribe before you scroll, because next time it could be too late. By midnight, Ayana was gone from the plaza. She had disappeared into the subway tunnels, carrying her blanket, her notebook, and the memory of a crowd that had shifted from mockery to reverence. But above ground, her absence didn't silence her. The clip had crossed into thousands of screens, and the comments were no longer just admiration. They were confessions. "I laughed at someone like her once, and I still feel sick about it. I judged someone last week on the train. I feel seen and ashamed. I don't want to be the kind of person who looks away anymore." The city had been given a mirror, and it didn't like what it saw. In the morning, sunlight spilled across headlines. A local blog posted, "Golden Voice on Cold Streets." A neighborhood paper ran with, "Homeless songbird stops city in its tracks." The photos were grainy, taken from shaky phones, but the story burned anyway. Some said she'd vanish like every other sensation, 24 hours of awe, then forgotten. But others insisted this wasn't spectacle, it was salvation. People were already arguing in comment threads about whether she needed protection, a manager, a roof, or simply respect. And somewhere deep in the subway, Ayana slept, curled beneath a blanket that still carried the scent of generosity. She had no idea the city was whispering about her, no idea her name was crossing into homes that would never welcome her inside. She dreamed of her mother's voice, soft, warm, steady. The first song she had ever known. Don't let the world forget her when the headlines move on. Subscribe, stay, and carry her story forward when others look away. Ayana's voice had lifted a plaza to silence, but now it was lifting a city into reflection. And soon, it would lift her into places she never thought she'd stand. The girl they laughed at was no longer invisible. The question was, would the city remember her tomorrow? Ayana woke to footsteps. The subway tunnel was never quiet, but this was different. Not the shuffle of commuters or the rattling echo of trains, but deliberate steps that stopped just a few feet from her blanket. She tensed, clutching her notebook close. In the half-light, a figure crouched down, no badge, no uniform, just a woman with a notebook and a press badge dangling on her coat. "You're Ayana, right?" The sound of her name made her flinch. For years, Ayana had existed as a shadow with no label. She wasn't supposed to be known. And yet, this stranger had carried her name like a secret she'd stolen. The reporter's pen hovered, waiting. "The city's talking about you. Videos of you singing last night have gone everywhere. People want to know who you are." Ayana said nothing. Her stomach was still aching, her throat raw, and the thought of more eyes staring at her filled her with unease. The reporter lowered her pen, softening her tone. "They laughed at you first, but they're not laughing now. You've made them see themselves." Ayana closed her eyes. She didn't want to remember their laughter, even if silence had followed. Have you ever realized too late that your laughter carried someone else's pain? If you know that sting, subscribe now before you turn away again. Above ground, the frenzy had begun. The clips of her voice had been replayed, reshared, edited into montages with captions like, "Golden voice in the cold," and, "She sang for food." Radio stations replayed shaky audio ripped from live streams, and talk shows debated whether the city had failed her or whether she was a miracle who had appeared to remind people of their conscience. In midtown cafes, office workers leaned over lattes to argue, "Someone's gotta sign her. No, she needs help first, a shelter, food, therapy. Either way, she doesn't belong on the street." Everyone had an opinion. But Ayana didn't know any of this yet. She only knew that her quiet corner of the subway no longer belonged to her. Within hours, people started arriving, first cautious, then confident. A man in a blazer carrying a business card introduced himself as a talent manager. He promised connections, recording time, exposure. He spoke too quickly, his eyes not on her but on her potential value. Then came others, curious onlookers, more reporters, a church volunteer offering to take her to a shelter, and a pair of vloggers with ring lights who wanted just a minute of her voice for our channel. Ayana shrank deeper into her blanket. It was overwhelming, this sudden inversion where everyone who had walked past her for years now wanted a piece of her. She sang because she was hungry, not because she wanted fame. And yet fame was now circling like hawks. By the afternoon, she surfaced back into the plaza. The same stone where she had been mocked 24 hours earlier now felt charged. There were candles still burning in jars. Notes scribbled on scraps of paper tucked near the planter, "Forgive us. Your voice saved me last night." Even flowers. Ayana's throat tightened. She had spent years being invisible, and now the evidence of her existence was spilling across cold stone. She wanted to weep. But eyes were watching, always watching now. A group of high school girls approached cautiously. "We saw you online," one whispered. "Your voice, it's like church." They pressed a sandwich into her hands before scurrying off. Not everyone came with kindness. A slick-haired man cornered her, thrusting a contract forward, his cologne suffocating. "Sign this now and I'll make you famous before sunset." His smile was a grin too wide, too hungry. Ayana backed away, clutching her notebook to her chest. Her voice was hers, the last thing the streets hadn't stolen. She would not sign it away on a cold afternoon because a stranger smelled money in her hunger. Would you sell your soul just to escape hunger? Or would you wait, even if the world dangled escape? Subscribe, don't let her choice be silenced by greed. As the day faded, whispers grew louder. News vans parked at the plaza. Microphones dangled near her lips. A preacher's voice boomed through a portable speaker, declaring her a sign from heaven. A city councilwoman appeared briefly, cameras in tow, promising initiatives for the homeless. It felt less like compassion and more like performance. Everyone wanted to be near her light, but few wanted to carry her darkness. Ayanna retreated into an alley, knees to her chest, the sandwich uneaten in her lap. The attention felt like a storm she hadn't asked for. She whispered to her notebook, as if the paper itself could listen, "All I wanted was food." But she remembered the faces that had softened, the boy who had dropped his folded bill, the guard who had shielded her, the woman who had replaced the ring with trembling hands. Not all eyes were cruel. Some had truly seen her. And that thought kept her steady, even as the world pressed closer. That night, she wandered to the edge of the East River. The wind tore at her coat, water slapping against rusted pylons. Across the dark, skyscrapers glowed like indifferent giants. She sang softly, not for a crowd, not for cameras, but for herself. Her voice mingled with the current, disappearing into the black water. And yet, someone heard. An old man on the pier, fishing rod in hand, froze as her song drifted past him. He turned slowly, eyes widening. He didn't film. He didn't approach. He simply listened, hat pressed to his chest, as if standing at a service. When she finished, she looked at him nervously. He bowed his head once, a silent thank you, then returned to his line. It was the purest audience she'd had, no mockery, no applause, just quiet reverence. That was enough to remind her, she wasn't singing for likes or contracts. She was singing because it was all she had left to give. Have you ever dismissed someone only to later realize they carried gold inside them? Don't be part of the crowd that looks away again. Subscribe, and stay until the end of her story. By midnight, Ayanna's face was on local TV. Commentators argued whether her talent proved the resilience of the human spirit or the cruelty of a society that let her starve. People debated while she curled under her blanket by the river, body shivering, notebook clutched like armor. She didn't know who to trust, or whether this sudden wave would lift her or drown her. But one truth had already become unshakable: the city could no longer claim it hadn't seen her. And tomorrow, someone would come, not just reporters or opportunists, but someone who could change her life entirely. The world had come knocking. The question was, would she open the door? Ayanna hadn't slept. The riverbank's cold had bitten through her blanket, and every gust of wind felt like a reminder that no amount of applause could warm bones. By dawn, she shuffled away from the water, her notebook pressed tight to her chest, her throat sore from the quiet song she'd given to the current. The city was already awake, delivery trucks growling through narrow streets, bakeries releasing the scent of yeast and butter, commuters rushing with paper cups. None of them looked at her, not yet. Fame was still digital, the real world still stepped around her. She wandered until she found herself back near the plaza. News vans still idled, their antennae reaching skyward like metallic trees. Reporters huddled in coats, waiting, hoping she'd reappear and sing for them. Ayanna slipped by unnoticed, too thin to cast a shadow on their ambition. She didn't want another crowd. She wanted silence, warmth, maybe someone who didn't see her as a story. That's when she heard the voice. "Are you hungry?" It wasn't shouted. It wasn't wrapped in performance. It was soft, plain, almost fragile. Ayanna turned. An older man stood a few feet away, paper bag in his hands. His coat was worn but clean, his hair streaked with gray. He didn't carry a microphone or camera. His eyes didn't flicker with calculation. They simply rested on her with the patience of someone used to being ignored. She hesitated. Hunger had taught her caution, offers often carried hooks. But the smell escaping the bag told her it was real: scrambled eggs, toast, maybe even bacon. She took a small step forward, ready to flee if he twitched wrong. "Take it," he said gently. "I bought 2 breakfasts because I hoped I'd find you." Ayana blinked. "Why?" "Because someone should." Her hands shook as she accepted the bag. The heat stung her palms, too good to be true. She opened it and nearly cried at the sight of real food. She sank onto a nearby bench, tearing into the eggs like they might vanish. The man sat beside her but not too close, leaving space. "I'm Samuel," he said. "I heard you last night." Ayana froze mid-bite. She braced herself for the words that usually followed: contract, studio, opportunity. But Samuel only smiled faintly. "I used to be a music teacher. Retired now. Thought my ears had heard everything. Then I heard you." Ayana chewed slowly, eyes suspicious. "People always wanted something." "You don't need to give me anything," Samuel said, reading her silence. "I don't have a company. I'm not here to film you. I just wanted you to eat." Her guard cracked, just a little. The food was warm, real, steadying. She looked at him fully for the first time. His gaze wasn't sharp like the reporter's or greedy like the man with the contract. It was tired, gentle, and present. How many times have we looked at someone starving and assumed it was their fault? If you've ever walked away from that pain, subscribe now. Don't keep repeating the same silence. They sat for a while, the city streaming around them. For once, no one pointed, no one jeered. It was almost ordinary, 2 people sharing breakfast on a cold bench. Samuel cleared his throat. "You remind me of a student I had years ago. She sang like you, like the world couldn't cage her voice. But she didn't believe it. I tried to tell her she was worth more than what the world gave her." He paused, eyes misting. "I don't know what became of her. I've thought about her for 20 years. Hearing you, it felt like being given a second chance to listen better." Ayana wiped her mouth with her sleeve. The words stung more than the cold. She wasn't used to being compared to anything beautiful. "Where do you stay?" he asked softly. "Wherever the cold lets me," she murmured. Samuel nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "There's a community center a few blocks from here. Not much, but they'll give you a bed, a shower, safety. I can walk you there. No cameras, no contracts. Just a door that won't close in your face." Ayana tightened her grip on her notebook. Her instincts screamed to refuse: trust was dangerous. But her body betrayed her, leaning slightly toward him, aching for warmth. She studied his hands. They were calloused but steady, not twitching with urgency, not reaching to grab. Just resting. She realized with a start that he hadn't once asked her to sing. That silence was louder than applause. They walked side by side through the waking city. Ayana's legs were weak, but Samuel slowed his pace to match hers. When they reached the community center, she hesitated at the door. The glass reflected her thin frame, her tangled hair, her hollow cheeks. Did she belong inside? Samuel opened the door but didn't step through. "Only if you want to," he said. "If you don't, I'll still walk you back to wherever you sleep." Ayana swallowed hard. For years, every door had been locked to her. This one was open. She stepped through. Inside, the smell of coffee and detergent hit her first. Volunteers bustled about, folding blankets, setting out trays. A woman behind the desk looked up and smiled without pity. "Welcome, love." Ayana froze. The word welcome felt foreign, like a song she'd never learned. She was given a towel, soap, and led to a small shower stall. Hot water poured over her for the first time in months, steam wrapping her like an embrace. She pressed her forehead against the tile and let tears mingle with the water. The city had laughed, mocked, filmed. But here, in this small stall, she was simply human again. Do you understand how many Ayanas never reach a shower, never get called welcome? Subscribe, and remember their faces instead of forgetting them. When she emerged, dressed in clean donated clothes, Samuel was waiting in the lobby. He looked up, and his eyes softened. Now the world might finally see you the way it should. Ayana sat with him at a table where other residents ate cereal and toast. No one stared. No one laughed. It was quiet, ordinary, and for Ayana, extraordinary. Samuel finally asked, "Can I hear you sing again?" "Not for them. For me." Ayana hesitated, then nodded. She hummed softly, her voice lower, gentler, filling the small room like sunlight creeping into dusty corners. Heads turned, not with ridicule but with stillness. A few spoons paused mid-air. For the first time, Ayana wasn't singing for food or survival. She was singing for connection. When she stopped, Samuel's eyes glistened. He whispered, "That's what I wanted to hear. Not the power. The soul." Ayana smiled faintly. It was small, but it was real. That night, she lay on a real bed, thin mattress though it was, with blankets that smelled of detergent instead of damp cardboard. Her notebook rested beside her. The city outside was still restless, still hungry, still cruel, but for the first time in years, she wasn't bracing for its bite. She closed her eyes, and sleep came quickly, without fear. If her voice reached you, don't walk away empty. Subscribe now, let her story stay alive in you when the crowd forgets. Morning light seeped through the thin curtains of the community center dorm, painting stripes across Ayana's blanket. For the first time in years, she had slept without fear of being shaken awake by strangers or the cold. The silence of safety felt heavier than the roar of the streets, strange, almost unnatural. She lay still, listening to the murmur of voices outside her door, volunteers chatting, coffee being poured, footsteps echoing against linoleum. No jeers, no laughter. Just ordinary life. For Ayana, ordinary felt like luxury. But the world outside the building had not slowed. It had only grown louder. By mid-morning, reporters were outside the community center, cameras pointed at the entrance, voices rehearsing questions. The story had outgrown the plaza. National outlets were running headlines, Golden Voice found on the streets. Clips of her songs had crossed oceans overnight. Inside, Ayana sat at a cafeteria table, staring at the plate of oatmeal the volunteers had given her. Her hands shook, not from hunger, but from the pressure pressing in from beyond the walls. Samuel sat across from her, sipping coffee, his posture calm. "They'll be here all day," he said quietly. "You don't owe them anything." "But they won't stop," Ayana whispered. Her voice cracked. "They'll keep coming." "They will," Samuel agreed. "But you get to decide who hears you, and when." Ayana clutched her notebook, the one thing she still controlled. Her songs were hers. But were they? The moment she sang them, they seemed to belong to everyone else. How often do we strip people of control just because we want their gift? If you've ever taken without asking, subscribe now, don't repeat that mistake. Later that day, the director of the center approached her gently. "Ayana, there are visitors. Some say they're agents, some say they're philanthropists. They want to meet you." Ayana's stomach nodded. She remembered the slick-haired man waving a contract in the plaza. She remembered how quickly kindness turned into greed. Still, she agreed to see one group. In a small office, two men in polished suits smiled too widely. They praised her voice, called her a miracle, and laid glossy papers across the desk. "We can make you a star," one said. "Recordings, interviews, even a tour. All you need to do is sign." Ayana's chest tightened. The words were dressed in silk, but the hunger in their eyes was the same hunger that had once laughed at her. She pushed the papers back across the desk. "I won't sign," she whispered. The men exchanged a glance, annoyance slipping through their polished faces. One leaned forward. "Think carefully. Opportunities like this don't wait." Samuel, standing quietly at the door, stepped forward. She already thought carefully. "The answer's no." His voice was steady, like a wall. The men packed their papers with tight jaws and left. Ayana exhaled, trembling. Samuel placed a hand on the desk, not on her, not taking, just steadying. "They'll keep coming," he said. "Each one louder than the last. You'll need to know which voices to listen to." That evening, the community center staff brought in a small radio. They tuned it to a local station. Ayana's clip was playing again, her voice spilling from static speakers. Callers phoned in, some weeping, some confessing guilt. "I saw her once on the subway and I walked away. I gave her nothing. Now I can't sleep." Ayana sat frozen, hearing her own voice turned into a current she couldn't stop. Samuel watched her carefully. "They're not hearing the song," he said softly. "They're hearing themselves." The thought unsettled her. Was she just a mirror now? A reminder of guilt people wanted to wash away with applause? Have you ever applauded someone only to hide the fact you ignored them yesterday? If that truth stings, subscribe now. Don't let guilt be the only thing you give. Night fell. The crowd outside the community center grew. Some held candles, some held signs, some just wanted to see her face. Ayana peered through a cracked window at their shifting shapes. "They'll turn on me," she whispered. Samuel tilted his head. "Why?" "Because crowds always do," she said. They laughed, then they cried. "One day they'll be tired, and then they'll forget. Or worse, they'll hate me for not being what they wanted." Samuel didn't argue. He simply said, "So you sing when you want. Not when they demand." Ayana hugged her notebook closer. Her songs weren't cages. They were wings. She had to keep them that way. The next morning, she walked with Samuel to a small church a few blocks away. The pastor had offered the space if she ever wanted to sing. Not for cameras, not for tickets, just for the people in the pews. Inside, the air smelled of wood and candle wax. A few dozen people sat scattered across benches, not reporters, not agents, just neighbors. Some carried grocery bags, some clutched children, some looked like they had nowhere else to go. Ayana stepped up to the front, notebook trembling in her hands. She began to sing softly, her voice curling through the quiet hall. This was different from the plaza. There was no spectacle here, no phones in the air. Just eyes that stayed, ears that opened. When she finished, no one rushed forward, no one shoved papers at her. A woman in the back whispered, "Thank you." That was all. And for Ayana, it was enough. If her voice moves you here, in silence, why should it take headlines for you to care? Subscribe so you don't wait for the world to tell you what matters. That night, she lay awake in her cot at the community center. The world outside was spinning faster than she could catch. Agents, reporters, strangers, they all wanted something. But here, she'd found one person who didn't. Samuel asked for nothing but honesty. For the first time, Ayana wondered if she might have the strength to shape her own future, not as a story owned by the city, but as a woman with a voice that belonged to her. The storm wasn't over. In truth, it was only beginning. But Ayana no longer faced it alone. The city never forgot her now. By the second week, Ayana's name had spread past the neighborhood blog posts and grainy phone clips. National papers ran headlines like, "Golden Voice of the Streets," and, "From Cardboard to Carnegie." A morning show sent a van to the community center where she slept, their anchors promising a heartwarming exclusive. Outside, cameras crowded the sidewalks, their lenses pressed against the glass like hungry eyes. Inside, Ayana sat on the thin cot, notebook balanced across her knees. She hadn't sung in days. Her throat was fine, it was her spirit that was weary. Every time she opened her mouth, she felt the weight of millions leaning in, not to listen, but to consume. Samuel sat by the window, arms crossed, watching the circus outside. "They'll wait all day," he murmured. Ayana lowered her eyes. "They want me to be something I'm not." Samuel nodded, but his silence didn't soothe her this time. She caught herself wondering, why was he still here? Why hadn't he left like everyone else eventually did? He said he wanted nothing, but in her world, no one wanted nothing. The thought unsettled her. Later that afternoon, the center's director entered, holding a letter. "This came for you." The envelope was thick, embossed with gold lettering. Ayana turned it over in her hands, then unfolded it carefully. It was an invitation, the National Stage Talent Gala. A chance to perform before the city's wealthiest patrons, broadcast live. The words glittered with promise, career-launching, life-changing, a platform the world will remember. Ayana felt dizzy. The air seemed to close in. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. The director touched her shoulder gently. "Sometimes the world chooses you." But Ayana knew better. The world didn't choose her, it devoured her. How many times have we demanded someone perform when all they needed was peace? If you've ever taken more than you gave, subscribe now before you repeat their mistake. That night, the community center felt too small. Reporters camped outside, shouting her name. Opportunists pushed contracts through the mail slot. Even fellow residents, once quiet companions, began treating her differently. One asked for selfies, another whispered about splitting donations if he pretended to be her manager. Ayana wrapped herself tighter in her blanket, but no fabric could shield her from the realization, fame had followed her inside. Samuel found her curled in the hallway. "You don't have to go to that gala," he said softly. "But if I don't?" she asked. "They'll move on." The words pierced her. Part of her longed for them to move on, to forget. But another part feared vanishing back into invisibility, as if the laughter at the plaza might become her only legacy. 2 days later, the church invited her back. The pastor spoke gently, "Our doors are open. Sing or sit in silence, you are welcome either way." Ayana sat at the front pew, notebook pressed tight. The sanctuary was quiet, but through the stained glass she could see the flashing lights of cameras outside. They had followed her here too. She did not sing. Not that day. Instead, she listened to the hymn of the congregation, voices rising and falling around her, unpolished but sincere. And in that sound, she felt what had been missing, they weren't trying to own her voice. They were sharing theirs. She left the church with tears she couldn't explain. By the end of the week, the gala organizers sent another letter, this one more urgent. They offered money. A hotel suite. A wardrobe. A promise of safety. "You will no longer be homeless," the letter read, as if homelessness were a costume she could shrug off with a performance. Ayana stared at the words until they blurred. Samuel watched her carefully. "Do you want to go?" She shook her head, then nodded, then pressed her palms against her eyes. I don't know. I don't know anymore. For the first time, Samuel looked tired. Whatever choice you make, it has to be yours. Don't let them trick you into thinking survival is the same as surrender. But his voice no longer anchored her. Doubt had taken root. What if he too wanted to shape her choice, even gently? What if every hand, even his, carried expectation? The night before the gala, Ayanna walked alone to the river again. The city shimmered across the water, neon reflected in broken ripples. She sang softly into the dark, not a hymn, not a performance, just a melody she remembered from childhood. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in memory, filling the spaces between her notes. For a moment, she felt whole. And then, clapping, she spun around. A small group of teenagers stood at the edge of the pier, phones pointed at her, live streaming again. Her private psalm was gone, stolen before it finished. Ayanna's chest caved. She pushed past them, fleeing down the pier, her breath jagged. Even the river couldn't keep her secret. Have you ever stolen a moment that wasn't yours to take? If you felt guilty remembering it, subscribe now. Don't let silence become another theft. The day of the gala arrived. Cars lined the theater's red carpet, glitter spilling from dresses and jewels. Reporters filled the air with noise, their cameras blinding. Inside, a stage glowed with gold light, waiting for her. Back at the community center, Ayanna stood before a mirror, wearing a donated gown. She barely recognized herself. The fabric was elegant, but her eyes still carried the streets. Samuel adjusted the strap on her shoulder gently. If you walk away now, I'll walk with you. If you walk onto that stage, I'll be in the crowd. The choice is still yours. But Ayanna wasn't sure anymore. Was it? The world had built a story around her, one she hadn't agreed to tell. Could she really choose silence now without betraying all the people who had wept, confessed, and called her a miracle? She pressed her notebook to her chest one last time. The limousine doors opened. The theater's lights burned. The audience roared at the sight of her, a sea of faces waiting, demanding. The host announced her name with grandeur, the voice that changed our city. Ayanna stepped forward, gown sweeping the stage, microphone trembling in her hand. The crowd fell into breathless silence. Behind her, Samuel stood in the shadows, nodding once. But even his nod felt heavy, like another expectation. She lifted the microphone to her lips. Her heart thundered. The city held its breath. And then, the screen goes black. Her voice does not come. Only silence. The audience, millions in the theater, millions online, millions watching at home, lean closer, desperate. Waiting for her choice. Does she sing? Does she walk away? Does she finally take ownership of the story written around her? We don't know. And maybe we never will. If you were standing there, would you demand her song, or would you let her silence be enough? Subscribe now, because her story isn't finished, and neither is yours.